On tonight's episode of Talkin Thrones, we talk about episode 2 of season 1 of the hit show, that being the Kingsroad. Pat, any thoughts going in?
Yay, it sounds like an ice cream flavor. So maybe a swirl of blood, sweat, and tears and some direwolf chunks here on Talkin TV podcast.
Oh, man. Already off to a great start. Talkin Thrones, people. Episode 2. Well, Pat, episode 2, overall, I'd like to think that episode 1 was a pretty big success. We ended with 45 views overall, so that definitely shows that the Game of Thrones hype is still in the air overall, I think it is safe to say.
Yeah, I think, hey, people might be checking this out for the first time, or if you're like me, you haven't checked it out in a while, and I'm going back to the beginning, I'm finding out some interesting things. I'll tell you that.
Maybe not as illustrious as you previously remember, but myself as a diehard book reader, I'm I got everything that I wanted and more from this first season. And then as time went on, not so much overall. But people, once again, welcome to the next episode of Talkin Thrones. As you can see in the title below, we were talking about episode 2 of season 1, The Kingsroad. Directed. This is ironically enough, Tim Van Patten, who was a guy who was known for directing vast swaths of some of the best HBO shows ever. This was the second and final episode that he directed for the entire show. I just realized that I wanted to bring that up, obviously, that he also directed last week's episode, the premiere, as well. This episode was also written by David Benioff and DB Weiss in the first of their many, many episodes that they wrote for this show. Overall, and obviously to kind of build off of your joke for the beginning, I feel like this episode fits, kind of kickstarts a lot of trends, if you will, right? It kind of kickstarts the trend of really not a lot actually happening in the seasons until the second episode, but also it kicks off just a lot. I feel like a lot of specific events and things that are referenced in the last couple seasons of the show when they get to the whole point of every other sentence out of the characters' mouths is a member berry statement. And I feel like that specifically starts with this episode.
You know, this episode for me was definitely a lot better than the first episode. Last week we had the article of the week and they said, first 6 episodes, pretty boring. To a certain degree, that's what they said. They said they were slower and whatnot. But this episode, it was definitely much different from the previous first episode of the series. And I think it has to do with the fact that the different factions are playing off of each other more. So we get to see, the Lannisters basically fighting with the Starks. And, by the end of it, we're seeing Cersei in the full cruelty that she's capable of.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the beginning of, I feel like this is, it's kind of the thing of where I've done this kind of cross-examination, not just with Game of Thrones, but with a lot of HBO shows as well, which is certain episodes will feel like the certain sect of that story, right? As far as kind of encapsulating the perfect television experience, where you'll be first episode setup, second episode, that's usually where things will really get going, right? Depending on the amount of episodes, right? Obviously, if it's a 10-episode season, right, episodes 5 or 6, obviously that feels like the midpoint. If it's a 13-episode season, usually episode 7 is around the midpoint that feels like the middle of the story. And then the penultimate episode will usually be some bombastic thing, in order to build up to the finale. And then the finale is kind of the reaction/epilogue that kind of builds up to the next season. And I feel like all of that is here in spades.
Yeah, usually the last episode of the season is sort of the direction in which the show is going to go. It's the mystery of, this character's doing this and that character's doing this. And so what happens? That's what you're going to be thinking about all summer or whatever the time frame was for these episodes.
All summer and all winter long into the next spring while you dream of spring until Game of Thrones inevitably brings winters back. But yeah, no, what's it called? Yes, 2 in particular that I can think of that do that really well. I really like the season 4 finale, which is obviously Tyrion murdering his father and then spiriting off to Pentos, and then Arya also going on her own journey. what's it called? Season 6 also, obviously, with, Cersei committing an act of domestic terrorism in King's Landing and just blowing up the Sept, murdering thousands of people, and now she's the next queen. You're like, wow. And then Daenerys finally like starts making her way towards Westeros. I'm like, wow. How do we come back from that after Cersei like makes her mark there? We're shaping up for war there.
Dom, we'll get to that in good time. It's going to be a slow burn until we get to those moments. But
to say
I'll
the
agree
least.
with you. I'll agree with you that in season 4 with Arya on that ship and she's looking for the man with no face, I kind of definitely enjoyed that cliffhanger. But
yes,
we have a whole lot of build up to get there. And one thing I want to ask you, Dom, is why don't we just start it off? What is your favorite moment of this episode? Episode 2, the King's Guard? Or
the Kingsroad.
Okay,
that's tricky because, again, there's a lot of stuff in here, right? I mean, I talked about it, right? The first season, more than any of the other future seasons that obviously would still be adapted from the books, is the best adaptation of the book. They, like, T for T gets almost everything that happened in the books pretty much down pat with, like, a few exceptions and added scenes, and that's really it. So, like, obviously seeing this episode as the continuation for the first episode, me as the diehard book reader was like, oh shit, they're really getting like everything right. So I mean, if I gotta go with my one, it's between two moments. One that was pulled directly from the books, one that was an add-on, sort of. I gotta remember correctly, specifically. What's it called? The first moment being obviously when Arya and Nymeria tag team on Joffrey, kind of. It's not exactly how that happens, but it's still awesome when it does happen, when she hits him with the sword and then Nymeria attacks him. Already the first indication of like what a little shit Joffrey is just in general. And then obviously the build up to this, obviously the setup in the beginning when Tyrion slaps him. In the book, I think he only slaps him once, but in the show, they just went all in. And they was like, yeah, just hit him as many times as you want. And he ended up hitting him 3 times, but I wouldn't be surprised if like he ended up doing like 7 times in like rehearsal and during the actual takes and something like that. So those are easily my 2 favorite moments from this episode.
Yeah, I would say that Joffrey really makes his presence known. And I think they do a good job of making him sort of the whiny prince that basically has some sort of power issues. Like he thinks, because I'm a prince, I get to do this. But in the opening scene with Tyrion, when he gets slapped and it's like, you will go and you will grovel to the Starks and you will do this. Basically, Tyrion's telling him, you're going to do that because politically that's what we need to happen.
Right.
Like, the fact that there's a plot going on, that his siblings, Tyrion's, brother and sister are a part of, like everything needs to appear as normal, like not going and groveling basically opens up suspicions. And so the whole slapping and the fact that Tyrion probably has always wanted to do this.
Oh yeah.
This is a moment in which he can get away with it because
absolutely,
if Joffrey doesn't do it, then that's going to reveal the Lannisters had something to do with Bran's fall. Right. And I think the best line, and this is where I was going with this, the best line of this episode is when Joffrey goes, I can't stand the whining of women, and then he gets slapped and
starts whining.
Yeah, the actors squirrel, and just really Joffrey is played perfectly. Like it's clear that he's whining just like he's complaining about, and I feel like he hides behind the sword, he hides behind the violence, and
right, he hides behind the facade of his princeliness.
Yeah, but he's easily put down if you just take the upper hand.
Right. And that happens multiple times throughout the show, as we see, and obviously again Tyrion and everyone else. And again, I feel so bad for the actor who plays him, because the actor who plays him, Jack Gleason, is, from what I heard, the nicest guy in the world, and he just had like the ultimate like kind of disservice of playing like one of the most despicable characters in television history. Like, Game of Thrones has had that trend, obviously, first with Viserys, then with Joffrey, and then later on with Ramsay, obviously, of just like really making their bad guys just giant loads of shit that you're like, yeah, I can't wait to see you die. And the good thing is that all 3 of them died in like the worst, most gruesome ways possible. But so with that being said, a couple things that I just did want to bring up also is that, before we got into the recap section, is that this episode in particular, like I said, is very, very apparent for kind of specific moments later on that get referenced heavily. A couple that come to mind, obviously, Bran being in the coma and what led him to being there. Jon being told by Tyrion what the Night's Watch is really like, which is, of course, set up by Jaime in this episode. Cersei informing us of Robert's aborted child. Jorah Mormont telling Viserys why he was banished. And also Robert and Ned's conversation about Daenerys and what would happen if the Dothraki crossed the Narrow Sea. All of that is very forthcoming particularly once the later seasons come around, because like I remember when season 7 was on the air. And one of the biggest things, obviously, circulating around the internet was the fact that it's like, yeah, basically everything that Robert Baratheon said about what would happen if the Dothraki crossed the Narrow Sea came true, essentially. Like, once Daenerys invaded, it's like what the Westerosis and the Dothraki are trained in different forms of combat to the point where it's like the Westerosi literally can't fight against them.
Well, let me ask you this, because you mentioned it. The Jorah, when he's talking with Viserys,
Right.
What is the whole crime that he committed? Because it basically, Ned banished him, I guess, and it was some poachers on his land. It was very vague.
This is what happened.
So
this is the origin. So again, this is the part where, again, you would only know this if you were a book reader, because they did not cover this in the show. Basically, the way that it happened was when Jorah inherited Bear Island after his father joined the Night's Watch, obviously, and Jorah took over Bear Island. He fell in love with a woman who ended up being super materialistic and like super like kind of like, the typical like type A personality as far as that goes. And the point being is that because of his supposed love for her, he ended up draining like all of the funds of Bear Island. And then she ended up leaving him, I think, to join a circus troupe or something. And then because he literally had no money left, he was literally forced to capture poachers on his land and sold them into slavery just to like be able to like afford to live. And then once Ned Stark found out, it was either you're banished or you're executed, basically. And that's kind of like the general gist of everything that happens there. And obviously, again, it's ridiculous. It's definitely, the whole thing is that it's a moment that Jorah shares with Daenerys in confidence, like once he gets like much, much closer to her, obviously, as the series goes on. But that was never mentioned in the show. And you would only know it if you read the books.
You know what I'll say, Dom, is a moment missed. They should have done a Guy Ritchie montage where all that's shown
Missed
like
friggin' opportunity. Benioff and Weiss, hit us up for that Game of Thrones like blooper reel. Like, what are you doing? Come on.
Yeah, that would have been perfect. Like 5 minutes, and we got that whole story. And it's like Jorah would have been a whole different character in my mind if that was.
I mean, Jorah himself is like a completely different character from the book. Like, even though obviously Jorah admits that he loves Daenerys, it's always like they always kind of like reconfigure it and make it so that it's like always more of like a fatherly love for caring for someone, as opposed to like in the book he gets like to like creepy levels as far as that goes. It's like, oh, does Jorah, in the books, like, they never directly say it, but they do insinuate heavily, like, oh, does Jorah have a thing for younger, women of a specific age? So, like, they definitely did. That was one of the things that they were like, okay, of all the things that they translated over that were excessive from the books, that was the one where we're like, oh, that's too much, we're not going to go that far.
Dom, I think, as the series goes on and the ups and downs, and he like gets kicked out of her court and then
comes back and then kicks out again and then comes back.
Yeah, I feel like they do mess around with that a little bit. Like his are his feelings sort of someone he respects, or are they of someone he loves?
Right.
But I don't really think they do much with it. And I think that's one of the things that, does happen throughout Game of Thrones. Including in tonight's episode, like they set things up, and
they just never fulfill them.
Yeah, well, it's more they don't necessarily handle them perfectly, and it's there, but it's very subtextual, and you can read into it, or you could just sort of gloss over it, and that's not really what you're there for. This show is definitely like about that body count, so
most definitely.
It's definitely one of those things where some of the nuance is sometimes a little bit more on the nose would work with that. Maybe it's too nuanced is what I'm getting at, but what else did you want to talk about? The Night's Watch and the implication there, because you
not yet. Let's save that for next episode, only because like I don't know, I kind of overestimated the whole like implication of the Night's Watch. More so, this episode was just about like kind of Jon beginning to understand what the Night's Watch was and what he was getting himself into before he actually experienced it, right? And that was the whole big thing that I always thought was interesting, is the fact that, again, so you have the Jaime scene, which is original to the show, and then you have the Tyrion scene, which is pulled almost beat for beat from the book, which is where it's both of them, like Jaime kind of sarcastically, sardonically, kind of making fun of Jon, being like, oh, thank you for your valuable service in protecting the wall, and then Tyrion kind of makes him understand, he's like, you're basically a guy. The Night's Watch is like the option, the second option that like most criminals take. Like you're basically partnering up with like a band of criminals, and kind of the.
Well, Tom, let me ask you, because I got the sense in this, in those scenes that it was basically the Night's Watch was held to high esteem, and it has kind of crumbled to what it is where it is basically the second choice for criminals. Death are the Night's Watch, and they
Right.
usually choose the Night's Watch. So it's one of those things where recruitment is not really high in terms of the noble houses.
Right.
And I think this is one of the things that you might not get with the TV show. Maybe this is one of the reasons why I should have stuck with the books and maybe dipped into it more. But the world building seems very like, now that I'm watching it a second time, I can sort of see that, because of the rebellion, that Robert had, and he, they slayed the Mad King. Basically, a lot of the things that happen in this series is solely because things are not the way they were meant to be.
Right. Which again
to be.
is kind of part of the reason as to what Martin is getting at with the books. Is a large part of the fact is we have these expectations for the kind of the way that these fantasy stories are supposed to go. I literally just rewatched Two Towers last night, and Game of Thrones is all about just showing, this is what happens when things that are supposed to be a certain way do not go a certain way, and kind of fall out from that.
But basically, the rebellion happens, and there's a new king, and the kingdoms are loosely held together, and so the Night's Watch is no longer basically properly maintained,
right?
And people aren't really joining from the noble families because they're off kind of controlling their dominions and really getting what they got from basically this changeover of power. And Robert, I get the sense in these first two episodes is not exactly the greatest king,
the most hands-on king,
ever.
As he is referenced directly in later seasons. Yeah, Barris and Selby directly says, Robert, he was a great warrior, he was a terrible king. And the time with Lannister, when he comes in taking shot after shot, literally being like, you have been a glorified bodyguard for two kings. What a madman, what a drunk. I'm like, oh, wow. Good to know that, like, Robert's knowledge of, like, everyone's low opinion of him was completely 100% justified. I don't know. That's supposed to make us feel about him as a character, especially since we know, obviously, how close Ned Stark is to him. But with that being said, I definitely think we should get into the recap of what actually happened in this episode.
Let's talk about it, because basically, I think we sort of covered the opening, right? Because
pretty much, which is opening scene, Weiss Dothraki. You see the Dothraki marching towards their homeland. You see Daenerys obviously on a horse, clearly still dealing with the after effects of her wedding, and Jorah trying to console her and not doing a good job of it, and of course helping her off. And then he has a little run-in with Viserys, where Viserys kind of like asks him, asks him to remind him like why he was banished, and he does the vague thing with the poachers, and then Viserys is like, oh, that'll never happen under my rule. I don't know exactly what that says about Viserys. I mean, we already know that Viserys is like, again, peak of just like human like civility, and proper etiquette as far as that goes.
Yeah,
but
there's something off with Viserys, and I think that's what the complexity of this scene. Basically, he's a one-tracked mind, not really making sense, in terms of some of the things that he's saying, and we're still treading water with Jorah. We don't really know who he is. We just get this sense that he's someone honorable, someone that's trying to help Dany. And, I think that's about it. We don't really know his past. His past is a little bit mixed. And really, I don't know if much else happens in this episode with him. He's sort of there. And at this point, if I was watching the show for the first time, I would be interested in like, how is this going to develop?
Right.
And then after that, we go to the Tyrion scene, which leads into one of the best scenes. Joffrey doesn't go immediately and grovel in front of the Starks. It basically is Cersei. And this happens after Tyrion leaves and goes to breakfast, and he finds Cersei and Jaime and
Tom and Marcella.
It's pretty much like Tyrion understands what happened. He knows
exactly what happened.
His siblings had something to do with this. And I don't know if because this is a couple days later from the fall.
If I actually did a little bit of reading on the Wikipedia, supposedly it's a month after the fall.
I think there is a line there. It's like, oh, it's been a month or something.
Yeah, something like that.
The opening time frames are very
all over the place. That's why I always was pissed when the 7th season was like, oh, they're teleporting all over the place. I'm like, did you watch the first season? A month or a year or something a year will literally pass at like a scene,
Yeah, true. So it's you shouldn't really expect to
Yeah.
have this continuity. I think they hide it pretty well here, but for the most part, it's just like a throwaway line, and they get into it. But Cersei has this really gripping moment where she's
Yeah.
talking about one of her sons, and they made a point of it being sort of the black haired child,
Yes.
and he succumbed to the fever, like wink, wink, the same fever that John Aaron succumbed to. You
Yeah,
know,
right.
so
How
it's
convenient that everyone that the Lannisters want to go away just goes away like that.
yeah, it's like check one off for the body count there. It's like you know,
Off-screen
they
death though, so it doesn't
it-
count.
yeah,
Or it's
I
it's a
guess, but
story in the past. So
the main thing is there's the subtext here that she's basically telling this heartfelt story about losing one's child and sort of relating it to Bran, and like basically telling her you have to let go. Uh, Cersei is hoping that she can emotionally get Lady Stark to sort of maybe pull the plugs in modern medical terms and sort of let him go. And clearly that's not going to happen, but like that's really the subtext of this
wow.
scene.
That's
And
just
it
added so much more. That's insane, honestly. Especially because this
yeah,
scene too is another scene that's original to the show. This scene was not in the book, so I think that's crazy. That I didn't even
yeah.
think about it like
There,
that.
there's so many layers in the scene, and it's the other thing is from later on we understand that the plot, I guess, between like Jamie and Cersei is like they're gonna have a child and pretend it's Robert's, and then like they're gonna be that's gonna be the next king, and that's pretty much what Joffrey is, right?
Right.
And we so the idea here in this early scene is the idea that well, Robert probably had a really good wedding night, and the first child was born, and then Cersei had to
Right.
basically,
Get rid of
let
him for
it
reasons that
go
obviously will come up
using her
later on,
words.
obviously, but also because of Robert's. Besides
Yeah.
Robert's vast infidelity, but surprising that was not the reason for why she did that. So we move on to a couple scenes involving Jon. Jamie's sarcastically congratulating Jon on joining the Night's Watch, kind of kicking off the scene that Tyrion will later fulfill on. And then he goes and he gives, in a very, very important scene that comes up later on, he gifts Arya her iconic sword Needle, which of course leads to another iconic line that is used throughout the series. Arya's infamous stick up with the pointy end. He then tries to say goodbye to Bran, only to be told to go away by Catelyn, because Catelyn once again shows just how much she disdains Jon here, obviously, rather unfairly so, obviously, given Jon's actual origin, but again, Cat has no knowledge of that. Then Ned comes in, Cat chastises him, says that, the last time
Yeah.
that he went south with Robert Baratheon, he came back with Jon, and now he's leaving him again, basically kind of unable to separate her strife of everything going on with Bran, and not wanting to, obviously being rightfully so fearful for Ned's safety going south, with kind of the duty and the oath that he swore and everything. Cat's got a big part of this character, and we're gonna get into her character, obviously, kind of spoilers ahead, but for the focus character segment, obviously, because she's definitely got a lot of interesting layers as far as that goes. And then also Jon says goodbye to Robb. Unfortunately, in this instance, obviously, the last time that he would ever see both Catelyn and Robb, and obviously Ned, unfortunately. But he says, what's it called? They have, I think, this really sweet little moment where they hug, and they're like, Jon says, "You Starks are hard to kill." And then something else about Snows. And it's just, I don't know. It doesn't, obviously have any lasting impact, because obviously, Jon references this moment in the opening of season 4, as referencing the last time that he saw Robb after Robb's untimely death at the Red Wedding. But, I don't know. There's, this really sweet moment between them, obviously. And the fact that I think it's kind of cool, this dynamic, where this could have so easily been, a rivalry where Jon has every single reason in the world to despise Robb. But the fact that they get along, and the fact that they really do treat each other like brothers, I don't know, that's something kind of really sweet and endearing, because it's something that in a story like this with all this death and misery and betrayal and backstabbing, where it's it's nice to see two people that are half brothers when in reality they're actually first cousins, but they can still get along like brothers.
Yeah, yeah. So just to sort of move the recap along, I think pretty much the only other things that really happen that we haven't touched on are really Daenerys, and basically what is she going to
Right.
do with Khal Drogo? Because she just got married to him, and she's sort of thrown into his bed, and he's just sort of doing what the wild man of the prairie does, I guess. He's dominating her. And this is something that, is from the very beginning of the episode, is something that weighs on her mind. This is like definitely not something she expected. She doesn't know how to handle it. She is really not prepared, to just be this man's plaything, for lack of a better
Yeah.
word.
We can say it. She's his property. Like that. That's essentially like how
Yeah,
the marriage transaction went down. She is his property.
and I think that's sort of discussed when she has like slaves of her own that are meant to upkeep her and make her look beautiful and all that stuff. Like she still sort of had this courtly position, but she befriends one of them, and basically,
Doria.
yeah, and basically she says, well, you got to stop having sex like a slave, and you got to basically have sex like a queen. And that becomes her arc for this story, is how does she tame this wild man and really turn the tables and make him hers. And it's very short lived storyline. I think there's only like two scenes throughout the remainder of this episode, but that's what happens is she spends some time with the slave, kind of role playing in bed, and basically when it comes to the next time that Khal Drogo enters the bedchamber, she basically gets some confidence, confronts him, and basically does end up turning the tables. And I
Yes.
think this basically, the way that Daenerys starts off in this show is really rock bottom, and she
Yeah.
gets there really quick. And then this whole, she's dealing with these problems, and no matter how drastic and sort of in deep she is in terms of struggling to get out, basically she does find a way to get control of the situation. And that's what we're going to see going forward with her character.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
Dom,
Absolutely.
what's sort of
Yeah,
the last thing?
really only three more major scenes, obviously, that are kind of like resolutions wrap up to the
Yeah,
stories. Obviously,
it's
John.
all dealing with Joffrey
Yeah,
and
well,
the
no.
kids,
So
right?
the first thing is obviously John's meeting with, John and Tyrion meeting up, where basically John sees the prisoners being brought to him, and Tyrion's like, "Oh, your brave new brothers in arms," and he's like, "You're a smart boy. Come on, you got to know what the Night's Watch is." Like literally right before they arrive at the wall. John's last scene in this episode is him arriving at the wall. But also one other quick scene is when they're first departing Winterfell. With his last scene with Ned, he asks Ned what his mother was like, and Ned obviously famously, unfortunately, says the next time we see each other, we'll talk about your mother, which unfortunately never comes. Catelyn, continuing to grieve over Bran, is attacked by an assassin who sets a fire as a distraction. What's it called? And of course uses the dagger made of Valyrian steel in order to attempt to assassinate Bran. Catelyn does her best to protect him, but at the end, the assassin is killed by Bran's direwolf Summer. And then afterwards, after finding a lock of blonde hair in the tower where Bran fell, she consults with Robb Theon, Maester Luwin, and Sir Rodrik Cassel, and basically comes up with the idea that the Lannisters are obviously behind Bran's fall, and that they're up to something as far as the throne goes, and that she decides to go south in order to warn Ned about what's going on. And then the final scene, obviously the scene at the Kingsroad Inn, when obviously the situation that goes down between Sansa and Arya and Joffrey, where Joffrey attempts to court Sansa and show off to her. They end up running into Arya and Micah, the butcher's boy, who are having this joust with swords. Obviously Joffrey attempts to intimidate the butcher's boy just to show off his princeliness. Arya hits him with the wooden sword in order to get him to stop. He tries to swing at her. He gets attacked by her direwolf, Nymeria. They run. She takes his sword, throws it into the river. They run into the woods. She knows that the direwolf is going to get killed if it gets caught by the Lannisters. She has him run off. Ned finds her, but she's brought before the queen. And basically, they manage to resolve the situation.
Ned doesn't necessarily find her, right?
No, that's right. She's found by the Lannisters, and then Ned finds out from Jory Cassel that she has been brought before the Lannisters. And then it unfortunately resolves with Cersei essentially forcing Robert to have Lady executed in place of Nymeria. So in a way, Sansa kind of does get hers for like not kind of going and siding with her family in that sense. This is kind of the first sense of like Sansa understanding, what it means to go against her family, obviously, which would lead to a very, very tragic kind of arc that she has to go through in the next couple of seasons after this one.
Yeah,
but
I'm gonna say this about this whole storyline. Like when Arya is packing her stuff, and it's like, oh, I've been told to repack this, and she's basically, Jon comes in with needle to gift to her. Basically, she tries to get her wolf to do commands like, hey, go grab that glove, help me pack. and the wolf won't pay attention. And it's a nice little subtle writing that's in this episode, where later on, when she knows that the wolf is going to sort of be executed, she's commanding it to leave and
Right.
fleeing, and it won't. It's not, she's too young. She's something, the wolf is not going to follow her. The wolf is sort of the lead, I guess. But she throws the rocks and the wolf eventually runs. And so I think just very subtle writing. I give props to that. Also with Sansa, just like the whole idea of, as this is unfolding in front of her and they're squabbling and fighting over the sword play, her just screaming like, "You're ruining everything,"
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
is
Her trying to continue to
basically,
be like the prim, prissy little princess that obviously again becomes drastically. It's
yeah.
just so interesting to see these characters so early on in their journeys and like kind of versus where they ended up.
Well, it's weird in the sense that Sansa has this sort of way things should be, and it's completely against reality. Like,
Right.
just from the very start of her character, she sort of just doesn't see the world as anyone else does. Doesn't see the world as us, the audience, sees it. Parents, like, basically, she is, I guess, for lack of a better term, sheltered, to the point where she's just like, oh, he's a prince, so therefore prince equals good, and all those kind of fairy tales that I heard, that's must be what he's like. And even though the evidence is sort of right in front of her, or at least we, the audience, get to see a lot more of that evidence, she's not really picking up on it. And I think that's going to be her characterization for a long time in this series. And it leads to, very drastic,
Yeah.
payoff. I think the dividends of keeping Sansa sort of, um, sheltered and really not seeing the bigger politics, I think that really pays off in the long run
I think
in
it's also
terms of,
interesting too, as far as kind of setting Sansa versus Daenerys, kind of what would pay off, not necessarily in this episode, but how they would pay off later on, specifically in the last season, where they're both kind of victims of vicious tragedy, right? And because obviously Daenerys is only a few years older than Sansa, right? But Daenerys has obviously kind of suffered in a way early on that Sansa never really has, right? So I think that's definitely really interesting as far as kind of how that bodes for them, later on, where Daenerys is like, for trying to be forbearing, but Sansa is just so closed off and everything, and just kind of like how that lack of relatability when they've gone through such similar circumstances, literally to the point where they've both, been held like as property by these vicious captors who have brutalized them both physically and mentally, and how that plays out. It definitely is interesting, and it's why, again, at the risk of spoiling obviously our thoughts once we get to that point, once we get to the last season, I definitely don't think the last season is all bad as far as what it's trying to get at per se, But with that being said, unfortunately, it ends with what's it called? It ends with Ned, unfortunately, what's it called? Having to commit the first of what's it called? Of the first of the 4 direwolf deaths that happen. Of the 6 direwolves we were introduced to last episode, only 2 of them end up making it through the entire show. Obviously, we said goodbye to Nymeria also in this episode, and we don't see her again until season 7. Obviously, when Arya has her little run in, I still love that scene completely. But there is also, again, there was another part that was kind of scrapped from the show overall, which is that in the books it is heavily hinted that in addition to the Brotherhood and everybody that's going throughout the Riverlands, there's also a giant pack of wolves that is seemingly operating independently, that's led by a giant direwolf that is referenced multiple times throughout the book. So I just wanted to bring up that little tidbit. And then coincidentally also, the minute that Ned pulls the dagger, unfortunately, on poor lady, as the first direwolf casualty, Bran wakes up at the same time. And of course, Ned also sees the Hound riding up with the body of Micah the Butcher's Boy, and the Hound famously being Joffrey's bodyguard. This is also, again, we don't know as much about the Hound yet, but we're starting to get like more glimpses and pieces, obviously, of Roy McCann's performance. And of course, there's that infamous exchange, the Butcher's Boy, you rode him down. He ran not very fast, which is a line that is pulled directly from the ending of that chapter overall. I don't remember. If I'm remembering correctly, I think that was Ned's perspective chapter that they did that from.
yeah.
So
So what I will say about the Butcher's Boy versus, what happened to Arya and Sansa, like, basically you have these nobles and lords, and they have this weird sort of sense of justice, which Cersei basically wants blood, and that's
Right.
why
Yeah, Cersei's
the
just
dire wolf
bloodthirsty.
gets
She just
killed.
wants to see the Stark suffer in some capacity. She doesn't really
Yeah.
care who gets it.
But it's very interesting to see that, basically the Starks are her enemy, and the only way that she could hurt them, in this circumstance that Joffrey sort of gets bit by the wolf, is to have one of the wolves killed. And it's a weird, sense of justice that they
Right.
get. And it's you can't directly attack them because they're nobles, but you can chip away at them in terms of, like, taking away this wolf and making you kill it,
Right.
etc. But then the butcher boy, basically doesn't get any justice. It's
None
like,
at all.
let's just mow him down. And so there is this dichotomy of different social classes, and we get to really see that here, and reflect, um, on, like, oh wait, this is sort of somewhat the way humanity seems to be. It's
Yeah.
not always great.
That moment, again, it's Jorah Mormont's famous line, which will come up in a couple of episodes, but is, why is it that the little people always suffer when the High Lords play their Game of Thrones? And that is a line that is so beyond freaking true to real life, it is not even funny. We're literally seeing the effects of it each and every single day as far as that goes. So
anyway, let's move to the review, right? So
you want to do the review first?
Yeah, let's do the
Okay.
review. It's right here on the in my rundown. So
all right.
So basically I read a couple of reviews, and a lot of them seem to be like recaps, like we just sort of discussed our favorite points, and but point by point. And
I love the subheading here too. Direwolves attack Lannister scheming Daenerys taught how to ride more than a horse. Wow.
Yeah, so basically, Entertainment Weekly, we'll put the link in the notes, but this was sort of 2 days after the episode first aired. James Hibbard wrote this article, and opening paragraph is, was I right? Was the second episode of Game of Thrones better than the first? Tonight's story was only about 10 minutes shorter than last week's premiere, yet felt half as long. With the heavy lifting of introducing the rival families out of the way, the producers started having fun with these characters and playing them off each other. It is known. So I definitely felt like this episode, the pacing was fantastic and increased. And I agree with this particular reviewer, James. So you definitely agree?
Yeah,
like
absolutely. It's again, I'm not gonna say I hate the premiere, obviously, but again, like, I'm a book reader, so obviously I'm gonna come into it with the perspective different than most people. But like, I'll be the first person to admit that just from a pacing standpoint, this is when the show to me kicks in a high gear. And like, again, it's part of the bingeability of the show is the fact that each of the episodes are pieced and paced as the next part in the story. So even though, again, certain criticisms they don't necessarily work as individual pieces, because this story is told so well over the course of these 10 episodes, like really taking the idea of serialized storytelling and upping it to the next level. I definitely think that, obviously, again, I think the pacing for this specific episode works as well, obviously, but like, it's more so to me, again, it's just another piece of the puzzle until we get to the end.
I think one of the biggest differences between the first episode and this one is predictability. So
yes,
in the first episode, introducing Bran climbing on the castle, and Lady Stark basically just shouting at him, like, don't do that, you're going to die.
Yeah. It's like instant setup. It's like, we know what's going to happen after that.
Yeah. If you basically have studied any form of storytelling or seen enough stories in films or read books, like, that that's a perfect setup for a later payoff where he falls in some fashion. And so that's where the show is going in episode 1. And you already see, a lot of people, I would say, have already seen where it's going. With this episode, you can't really guess that Ned Stark is going to have to do a mercy killing with one of the wolves. It is very subtly and craftily put into other scenes that are developing characters. And then suddenly, the kids kind of fight, and they're brought, in front of Robert, and things happen quickly. And I think the show, stays ahead of the audience, and that's what really drags the excitement for this episode. Yeah. Any last thoughts on that?
No, yeah. The only thing that I really have to add to that is I definitely think the kind of Robert's bit at the end of, kind of kowtowing to Cersei, where it becomes immediately clear that Robert and Cersei's marriage is not one out of love, like, at all. It is one made for political gain and advantage. And the only kind of, obviously in order to, like, kind of keep their alliances satisfied and understanding that her, when it comes to, like, the real power in Westeros, her father Obviously, Tywin Lannister, who we'll meet in a couple of episodes, holds a lot of the power and sway and influence in Westeros. You know, considering the fact that he was handed the king to Aegon Targaryen. Mad King Aerys Targaryen for over 30 years. You know, but beforehand just shows like kind of the sway. And so obviously he has to even though it's very clear that in any instance where he has to choose between her and Ned, he's going to go with Ned, obviously, for obvious reason, just because of their bond that they have. But he obviously has to kowtow to Cersei in certain instances. And I definitely think they kind of, again, in this one instance where it's like the one instance where he kowtows to her is, the murder of this direwolf, which he knows is the sacred symbolic head of the, symbol of the Stark family. I feel like it's like, again, the first of many, many poor decisions on his part.
Yeah,
as far as that goes.
The line basically, "Is this your command, my liege?" And then he just walks away.
He just walks away.
Like Robert doesn't
walks
even
away.
answer.
It's like, wow, dude. Okay.
It's one of those moments where, it's unspoken between the two of them that this has to happen, and there's nothing that he can do. But he refuses to command him. So it's the two of them, understand duty to each other and understand like what they're in for. Like, I think this is one of the first moments where Ned really hopefully sees the writing on the wall that something is amiss in Robert's court, and that, it's not going to be an easy thing being the hand of the king,
right?
Because there is some plot involved. And, I think hopefully, I guess the show's over. So, but hopefully Ned would have seen this, and I guess he didn't see it.
And it becomes very clear that he doesn't. Yeah, just as far as like kind of, and again, it's just like all the signs are right there slapping him in the face as far as, the Lannisters are like these specific types of people. They cannot be trusted. And, they are doing everything they can already to undercut him, at every chance they get. So, again, just the writing on the wall there as far as that goes. But, so focus character segment.
No, just let me one more thing about this article before I wrap up. So basically, they're describing the Daenerys storyline, and the author goes, "We interrupt this EW recap for a reminder. HBO aged Dany up from the novel from 13 to 17. They did. But still, she's underage. So you're not permitted to find this hot, you perverts. And don't blame HBO for entrapment. They're simply telling a story based on the beloved novel. It's not like the network is actually trying to turn the viewers by showing all the sexy scenes with a nude 17-year-old character, right?" I don't know, like this. Wow, this seems like a weird diatribe in the article.
That's a weird. Like, are you trying to bait them, or are you? That's really weird. It's like, dude, pick a lane, stick with it.
Yeah, I don't know what
what are you trying to insinuate here? I mean, she was 20. I mean, she was 25. The actress in real life, as far as that goes, at the time of filming. Yeah. So
the main thing is, I don't know where EW, like this particular reviewer, was going. But it brings up one of my points is that they're very ambiguous with Dany's age. Like, would you, from watching the show, know that she's 17 or in her teens?
Not at all. I would have said like youngest 19 or 20, just based off of what she looked like.
Yeah, so they're very ambiguous. I don't think the show really utilizes her age to really guilt you into
and I think rightfully
understanding the stakes.
Right, and I think rightfully so, honestly.
Well, yeah, because it becomes a much different show if they, make sure that
constantly harp on the fact. Versus really in the books, I remember it was a thing they constantly brought up how young she was, because that was a point that they really wanted to drive home of just how wrong and just how effed up this scenario was.
Yeah. So anyway, I thought that was interesting that this guy sort of, went on a little bit of a tangent, but
just a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's like, it's one of those things where this is a crucial storyline for her character. Like I said before, she's pretty much at rock bottom, and she gets the confidence to turn the situation around. It might not be the best solution at the time, but it is a better solution. Which is, as we will learn in Game of Thrones, usually even the best of all scenarios is usually still not best for everyone, to say the least. But the trials that Dany go through basically leads her to a stronger character and a stronger place. So she has to start somewhere. And, I think these early challenges are something that really make the character better in the long run. Anyway,
Absolutely. Yeah,
let's talk about
so
your focus character.
focus character
Who
of
is
the
it?
week. Today we are talking about Catelyn Stark, formerly known as Catelyn Tully, portrayed by Michelle Fairley for the first 3 seasons of the show until she unfortunately met her untimely end at the Red Wedding. She was born to Hoster Tully, and I believe her mother's name was Joanna Went, if I'm remembering correctly. She has 2 younger siblings and an uncle, obviously, all of whom we are introduced to later on in the show. Her younger siblings being Lysa Tully, who would eventually become Lysa Arryn when she married Jon Arryn, and and Edmure Tully, who unfortunately married Rosalind Frey at the aptly previously mentioned Red Wedding, as well as a single uncle, Brynden the Blackfish Tully, who in the books we are introduced to in this book, or in this case this season, but in the show we're not introduced to until season 3. She was originally actually set to marry Ned Stark's older brother, Brandon Stark, who we'll get to in our GOT-chaverse segment, obviously. He was unfortunately murdered by the Mad King in a series of events that ended up leading to Robert's Rebellion. And then she eventually ended up wedding Ned in his place, obviously, much to the chagrin of her childhood crush, who we'll meet next episode, Peter Littlefinger Baelish. Obviously, she bore 5 children for Ned Stark, obviously, in addition to Ned's bastard son, Jon Snow, who we brought that, of course, being Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon. Catelyn is an interesting character, I'll say, because I think that while obviously she has her own individual prejudices and thoughts on how the world works, she's got a different take than Ned, obviously, where Ned is obviously very honor-bound, literally to the point where it supersedes over his own life. Catelyn, and I don't know if this comes from just kind of the fact that she's just got more common sense because of where she was raised. Ned obviously being raised in the north, very away, very isolated from everything else. Catelyn obviously was raised in the Riverlands, which are bordering to the Westerlands, so she was obviously grew up in the south, quite in the thick of it, obviously, during Aerys Targaryen's reign. Catelyn definitely seems like she's got like more of a head on her shoulders, right? As far as she goes about things much kind of more quietly and subtly and under the radar. She only makes a move when she really has to, obviously, with obviously her abduction of Tyrion, obviously, but does show that unfortunately she is still prone to making emotional decisions. Not as much, I'll say, to the chagrin of her own life, the way that her husband, the way that her son does later on, obviously with Robb's infamous, wedding to Talisa Maegir. But it's definitely, I feel like, interesting, especially because she's gotten such a bad rap. I feel like mostly, maybe, possibly due to the portrayal on the show, as opposed to, like, if I remember correctly, I think she's portrayed as being much younger in the books than she is in the show. The other thing, obviously, famously to keep in mind is that she is actually still alive in the books, despite having not reappeared on the show since her death at the end of season 3, which is that she is brought in the books. She is brought back by Beric Dondarrion as Lady Stoneheart, through the Red Priestess fire, whatever, and is now leading the Brotherhood without banners.
So, Dom, I was waiting for this to happen the entire series.
And it never did.
It just never happened. And I realized at some point it was never going to happen.
Right.
But it's one of those things that this particular actor, this particular character is really fantastic. Like, does create a really cornerstone for the first couple of seasons of just someone that's fighting their hardest, really fighting back at the games that are being played by the other side. And she's, ruthless, but she's, has the right to be, she's really defending her family and pushing back. And I think the best part of this particular episode 2, is when Jon Snow comes in and it's like, I'm here to say goodbye to Bran. And she's like, you did, very cold,
blunt, very point. Matter of fact, it's like, wow, she makes her thoughts on him known, as far as she's like, I'm sure that if she had a chance, she wouldn't even refer to him by name. She would literally just refer to him as bastard,
Yeah, but then she gets hotter, like when he sits there and he tells Bran, like, you'll come to the wall and I'll be settled in and I'll walk you around and maybe we'll go beyond the wall and blah blah blah. And she's just,
again, very foretelling on both of their fronts.
Yeah, she's ready to strangle him after he says that, and wants him to leave. And I think it's to me, I didn't really understand her anger that much. It's like, damn, I probably don't think I ever really get her anger.
Yeah.
I understand the story that Ned sort of did this infidelity.
Again, that Ned went off to war and then he came back with this bastard child. But again, like, that's just more part of like kind of how she just like her never, and it really sucks because ultimately all of her tragedy in this entire show comes from her involvement with the Stark family. Obviously, first with Brandon's murder, and then obviously with Ned and that situation. And again, it really sucks because with Ned and Jon, and that was a situation that, again, is revealed to be entirely out of Ned's control, because Ned bringing Jon home and raising him as his own is literally, the dying wish that his sister gives, obviously, Lyanna, in order to protect her son, obviously.
So my question is, like, Ned being the man that he is, wouldn't he have clued in his wife, Catelyn?
You would have thought, but again, it's the only thing that I can really say in order to answer that is that it was definitely probably a Starks only thing, right? And it was just a fact of where nobody could know, because if Robert ever found out that Jon would have been dead quicker than you would have snapped your fingers, because again, just because of how much Robert hated the Targaryens, and any remainder of them would have been like, no. So it's like, even if he could have clued her in any way, shape, or form, again, would have been more detrimental to Jon, because again, it's a matter of putting up with abuse for being a bastard or just being dead, Well, and that's kind of like the back and forth that we deal with in this world.
To me, it would make it a little more interesting, if we as the audience understood that Catelyn sort of knew that Ned was lying to her.
Right.
And that Ned, came up with this story of, oh, this is my bastard child. It was the war. Like, he clearly lied to her, and she should have a sense that it is like Robert's kid, and, or not Robert's kid, but maybe that's what she thinks. You're lying. Yeah. You're lying to me. And this must be like Robert, but you're taking care of him. Like, there should be some sort of dynamic there that, in my mind, that makes her so angry, because it's not necessarily that she's angry at Jon Snow. It's that she's angry at her husband for, this
act of supposed infidelity.
So I think it leaves, too much to the audience to, basically figure out. And it's like, to me, I'm just like, chill.
Right. The other thing, too, obviously, again, is the whole thing of, again, building up the fan theory and the fact that Jon's parentage is revealed as a twist, obviously. And then that, again, as we referenced last week, that was an impetus for Benioff and Weiss getting the gig, obviously, is the fact that they were able to successfully guess who Jon Snow's mother was. And in this sense, obviously, it is revealed later on that it is Lyanna Stark, obviously, and that he is, obviously, Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen's originally bastard child. Now, obviously, with previous knowledge, it's revealed in season 7, not actually as once he's revealed to be the rightful heir to the throne, obviously. So that actually kind of brings us, obviously, wrapping up on the focus character segment, into kind of the subject of it, which is Robert's Rebellion, obviously, which is, again, the civil war that preceded and took place 15 years roughly, 20 years. Yeah, 20 years roughly prior to the events of the series, obviously. It started, again, during the reign of the last Targaryen king, that being Mad King Aerys Targaryen, who had been going a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs during the last couple of years of his reign. It all started at a tourney that was held at Harrenhal in 281 AC, in which Rhaegar Targaryen crowned Lyanna Stark, who was obviously, Ned Stark's older sister. Ned Stark famously had 3 siblings: Brandon Stark, Lyanna Stark, and then his younger brother, Benjen Stark, who became a Night's Watch member, who was betrothed to Robert Baratheon, obviously. And that obviously did not go well. And eventually it resulted in a supposed abduction in which Rhaegar kidnapped Lyanna, I believe, at that same tourney. After the results of this, while this was going on, this supposed abduction, Ned and Robert were both currently with Jon Arryn, training at the Vale, obviously, where they were his wards, obviously. Upon hearing news of this, Ned's father and older brother, Torrhen Stark and Brandon Stark, Rickard Stark and Brandon Stark, obviously, who was originally betrothed to Catelyn, rode south to King's Landing in order to demand that King Aerys do something about it. And Aerys' response was to hang Rickard Stark over a boiling pot of fire. Obviously challenging, saying that, Rickard Stark, I believe the impetus was that he wanted to challenge somebody to a fight, and he said that if he wanted to challenge a Targaryen, he would have to challenge the Targaryen's main strength, which was fire. So he held Rickard Stark and chained him over a boiling pot of fire, where he slowly roasted to death. And then poor Brandon, was tied up by a rope and forced to watch, and said that if he could reach the sword that was held like just in front of him, just out of reach, and then he could cut himself and free his father. And instead, he literally strangled himself to death, trying to free himself as he watched his father roast alive in front of him. So if that doesn't tell you everything that you need to know about Mad King Aerys Targaryen and everything, and it just sucks because Obviously, it's later revealed that obviously Rhaegar did what he did out of actual love, but it just shows, again, I feel like that's just Game of Thrones in general, is that an act of true, pure love results in all of this chaos and all of this carnage and all of this death. Obviously, again, it forced, what's it called? Obviously, it was followed up by Aerys Targaryen sending word to Jon Arryn saying that he could either declare his loyalty to the realm by having Ned and Robert killed right there, obviously, in order to kind of stamp out any sense of rebellion, obviously. Jon Arryn famously sided with Ned and Robert. Ned and Robert were both able to escape from the Vale silently in order to get to their respective castles in Winterfell and Storm's End and muster their forces, obviously. Ned also rode down to Riverrun, along with Jon Arryn, where they respectively married Catelyn and Lysa Tully in order to get Hoster Tully's forces on their side. Tywin Lannister famously sat out, and Walder Frey famously sat out a majority of the fray. The Tyrells and the Martells famously fought on the side of the Targaryens. Due to obviously the Tyrells still considering themselves loyal to the realm, and the Martells being bound to the Targaryens through marriage, obviously, because Elia Martell was Rhaegar Targaryen's first wife, obviously. It eventually resulted, obviously, in the Battle of the Trident, in which Robert famously brutally defeated and killed Rhaegar in single one-on-one combat. Ned Stark then obviously got to King's Landing, obviously, but unfortunately were beaten by Tywin Lannister, who was, okay, now I gotta get my history right. So Mad King Aerys Targaryen was convinced by Grand Maester Pycelle to open the gates to the Lannisters, thinking that they would be on their side, and instead the Lannisters got to purging the city, obviously, and attacking it. Famously, Jaime Lannister then obviously committed his famous sin, for which earned him the title of Kingslayer, which is famously murdering Aerys Targaryen. Shortly before the Starks got there, he found, obviously, Jaime Lannister sitting on the Iron Throne, waiting over Mad King Aerys' dead body. Elia Martell and her two children were brutally murdered by Gregor the Mountain Clegane, the Hound's older brother, obviously. And then famously, Tywin Lannister presented the bodies of Rhaegar's children to Robert wrapped in shrouds, which disgusted both Ned Stark and Barristan Selmy, who was the last surviving member, who along with Jaime Lannister was one of the last surviving members of Aerys Kingsguard. Ned then obviously famously went south to the Tower of Joy, where he found Lyanna on her deathbed, obviously, wherein famously he had a famous fight, which we see later on in season 6 during Bran's flashback, where him and Howland Reed are famously the only survivors in their fight against Sir Arthur Dayne and the other Kingsguard members who they managed to kill. And obviously, as is revealed later on, Lyanna's dying words, "Promise me, Ned," were obviously to take care of baby John, who was a result of Rhaegar and Lyanna's communion. So
this is a lot of
it's a lot of information, obviously.
Like Dom, I'm listening to you and I'm like, this is
this and half the stuff is not even told to you, even in the books. This is just like from reading off the Song of Ice and Fire wiki.
So for the most part, this begs one question. Do you think, we're 2 episodes in.
Yes.
Do you think they have peppered in enough of this rebellion and what's happened in Westeros, to really support what's coming next? We know for sure that Robert is going to die. I've seen the episode before.
I think it's pretty safe to say, just based on his health overall, before we even get into the plot of the Lannisters, he's not exactly the healthiest guy. He's 30 pounds overweight and does nothing but drink. It's either he's gonna get gout, his heart's gonna give out, or his liver's gonna explode. Because also this is
what happens is he has a mysterious
or a combination
fever,
of all three in this case. But
the Lannisters like taking their foes out with fevers, but for the most part, that should be their new house slogan.
Maybe that should be their house slogan. If you cross us, you're gonna get a really wicked fever that you'll never recover from.
Maybe it was too on the nose. Hey, we murder your foes with fevers. Versus a Lannister always pays their debts.
And the funniest thing is that's not even their words. That's not even their words. The funniest part, their house words are "hear me roar." But they even say that in season 2. It's a common misconception that because a Lannister pays their debts, it's said so often they think it's their words, but those are not their house words.
Really?
Yes.
Interesting.
It's "hear me roar" are the Lannister house words.
What was this, Katy Perry? No.
Right.
But anyway, for the most part, I just think it's fascinating to listen to the backstory and hear all this stuff that happened, because it basically informs how shaky season 1 is in terms of the politics in this world. but we get thrown into it. We don't get
Right.
a
We
lot
don't
of that
get any of
backstory.
this. And like I said, it's not even really that covered that. Like certain specific moments are brought up throughout the books as far as their reference to things go and throughout the show as well. But as far as like getting the complete history with like the specifics, nitty gritty, like that I only get from like, you know, again, you're only going to get that if you are devoutly listening to every single piece of the rebellion that is brought up by every character that brings it up throughout the show and then figuring out the timeline of yourself, you know? So as far as kind of to answer your question, no, I don't think it's entirely necessary as far as informing the context. Because I think that how it functions is exactly how it's supposed to function, which is it's a series of events that eventually led to kind of the instability that we're experiencing right now, which will eventually lead to more instability. As far as kind of the, you know, as far as what you were talking about before, as far as, you know, having our one thought process of how things should be versus seeing kind of what they've actually become, you know?
Yeah, I don't know. Last thought on this is I think now that I'm watching this a second time, I'm picking up on some of the nuances of what's happened in the past, the things that are not really shown to us that, you know, I now know because I've seen the whole entire series. But I think they could have basically shown us a little more, peppered a little more of this backstory in there,
Yeah.
just so that we know what's at stake up front. You know, it's very easy for us now that it's 8 seasons done. I've seen everything. I can go and be like, huh, this is very interesting. This is very subtle. But you know, with a TV show, you're not necessarily going into it expecting to watch 8 seasons and then watch it again. You know, this is such a great show that it's kind of worth watching a second time. But you know, it's not something that everybody is going to dip back into right away.
Yeah.
Anyway,
yeah. So last section, obviously, our famous viewer comments. Again, it's going to be pretty one-sided because once again, Eric Thorpe reviews being a champ and just commenting throughout the entirety of it. But he did bring up some very valid points, I think. So his first point, seasons 4 and 6 especially have wild episode 2s. I definitely do agree. Obviously, both with the Lion and the Rose, famously being the Joffrey's wedding episode from season 4, and then Home in season 2, which famously results at the end of that famous Jon Snow coming back to life. OMG, yes, Tyrion slapping Joffrey is the best. I do agree with that.
Yeah, and then he everyone just likes Tyrion as a character. Yeah, right. So I think
Tyrion's best. Tyrion's the best.
Anytime that he provides real good like comedic effect,
yes, it's the best. Obviously,
they're gonna get behind it.
Yeah, this other comment, I think the show for the most part made the characters more noble / likable. Well, the ones that you're supposed to like at least. Haha. Yeah, I agree with that. I definitely think that, again, like every single character in the books, again, part of the likability of the books is the fact that kind of none of these characters, even the more likable ones, like they all have kind of like their shades of gray, and definitely like some other like of the lesser characters like definitely like become more and more heinous as time goes on. But I definitely do agree with that, obviously. And then to answer your question, yes, this is the episode where Jon is traveling with Tyrion, right? What's it called? And this is the other thing too that I think is interesting. If he remembers right, in the books it's Joffrey who sends the assassin to kill Bran, but it's Littlefinger in the show. So here's the interesting thing. In the book, right, the whole the person who sends the assassin is never revealed, right? The only thing, right, that's really revealed to us in the books as far as that goes is Tyrion on his own. Well, I think in the events that are leading up to his trial at the end of book 3, A Storm of Swords, which we obviously see in season 4, he reasons to himself that Cersei would have been too smart to send the assassin, right? Because it would have been too easy to traceable, especially using a dagger like that. And Jaime just would have done it himself, right? That's why it couldn't have been either one of those two. So that's what leads him to assume that it's Joffrey in the books. But in the show, it's never really explicitly said. So I always kind of assumed that it was Joffrey, right? It's not like a situation of like Joffrey's murder, which is explicitly revealed to us to be Olenna and Littlefinger working together. So I don't really know the answer to that question per se, but it definitely is a good point.
Well, it's kind of hard to deal with who sent the assassin because basically they're in Winterfell for the month, right? You know, it's that weird time jump.
Yeah,
like you know, for
that's
Littlefinger,
why I definitely don't think it was Littlefinger. Only because Littlefinger stood to gain nothing from that.
They would have to pigeon to King's Landing, and then he would have to pigeon back. What is there, like a pigeon assassination?
Something like that. Yeah, and again,
it's
if we're going
it's
to
like the Westeros Uber, like you just give a message to a specific
Right, but
pigeon
again,
and
based
it
off
goes
of
and
that,
finds his
also,
assassin?
like, it would kind of be
Like, I don't know.
redundant for it would kind of be redundant for Littlefinger to do that, because Littlefinger's already set things in motion by having Lysa poison Jon Arryn and then framing the Lannisters for it, as far as setting up the whole Stark Lannister feud that's going to eventually erupt into the War of the Five Kings. So Littlefinger's already gotten his whole ball rolling there. So that, again, in addition to all the reasons that you said, it doesn't make any sense why Littlefinger would want to have Bran kill, especially since at this time period, again, Littlefinger still cares deeply for Catelyn, and that love still does extend to her children. And then Eric's last point that he says on the last season, that he doesn't think the last season is bad. It just could have been so much better, but I still think it works more than people give it credit for. Again, we'll get to that when we get to the last season. And then AJ reacts to popping in for the last little bit there, saying just stopping by to say hello and show my support. You guys freaking rock. Well, thanks, AJ. Thanks for tuning in once again. So yeah, that is a majority of the comments overall. But yeah, Pat, did you have anything else that you wanted to add to this episode before we wrapped up and got out of here?
Well, no one took us up on posting in the comments what we thought.
Yeah,
the body
right.
count
We
would be.
deliberately stated that last episode. We're keeping the death count, obviously, throughout the show.
No one cares, like, how how astute we are in terms of the people.
Clearly not. Clearly not.
Here's my thing is, I only think one person could be added to the body count. What do you say, Dom?
So you're going with one?
Yeah, I'm going with one.
All right. So we have, if we're counting animals, we have 3 deaths. 3 deaths in this episode in order to add to the 4 from last week. So last week, obviously, we famously had the 3 Night's Watchmen members that died, and then obviously Jon Arryn, who we see lying dead there. And then, so the 3 deaths that we get in this episode are the assassin, who is sent to murder Bran, who promptly has his throat chomped out by Summer. We have Poor Lady, the first of many direwolf casualties that happened, unfortunately, executed by Ned Stark outside the Kingsroad Tavern on orders of Cersei and Robert. And finally, obviously, Micah, the butcher's boy, who was rode down by the Hound, obviously, and also later gives Arya incentive to murder him. So we got, again, 3, no less than 3 deaths in only our second episode of Talkin Thrones.
I was basically only counting Lady. So,
I mean, I guess that goes as far as that, right? We keep saying you can like, it's horror movie rules. Like, you can have bodies stacked up to here as far as human bodies go, but the minute you kill an animal, that's when you're like, no, this motherfucker's gotta go.
In terms of connections, that, like, obviously that's going to hit hard for the Starks.
Right.
That one of the direwolves had to be put down. The butcher's
I
boy.
will say, real quick side note, Sansa does forget about that death pretty quickly as far as that goes. You're like, obviously Arya never forgets about Nymeria, right? Summer obviously dying, that's an event that didn't happen in the books, obviously, but like, and obviously Grey Wind and Rob are both killed at the exact same time, so that's pretty symbolic there, but like, Sansa moves past Lady pretty quickly as far as that goes, so I just wanted to point that out there. A little bit of a nitpick, but
I don't know, it's like the butcher's boy gets a one line, like, oh, you ran him down, and then it's over. There's not much emotional weight put behind the butcher's boy or the assassin, and they're kind of just forgotten. In this game.
But again, if we're keeping up with the overall death ticker, again, this is a show about death, about life and death.
I guess I'm taking the point of view of basically which ones have an impact,
right?
And the assassin and the butcher's boy are unfortunately disposable.
Very disposable.
To most of the people.
You can only imagine what's going to happen when we get to Hardhome and Battle of the Bastards and Blackwater. Oh my God! Yeah. Talk about disposable bodies.
So yeah, we're going to be counting each frame.
Okay, that guy. Okay, did you get that guy in the background? So I think when we get to that, what we're going to have to do is, rather than have a specific number of people who died, we're going to have to have rough estimates. Are we in like the 30s or 40s, or are we in like the hundreds as far as that goes? And we'll have to guesstimate just like how many people died.
Yeah. Do you think we can go on like a Fervor or a TaskRabbit and have someone literally count the bodies that they see?
Trust me, I'm sure those YouTube videos exist. YouTube videos exist.
All right. Well, if anyone finds one of those YouTube videos, like, just post them in the comments so that we can watch. So we can
keep track how many people died in the respective battles that are yet to come. Obviously,
well, I just want to see if someone is that much of a diehard. Like,
right?
I'm rewatching these episodes.
Like one of those
I'm having
dingers
fun,
that just like the
but-
ding goes off every time somebody dies, and it's like just going like through the roof as far as like into like the 100,000s. Like
Yeah.
literally in Battle of the Bastards, it was like piles upon like multiple piles of human bodies. Like,
Well, it would be easier to count how many people survived that. But
yeah, right.
anyway,
Anyways, so
I
that
guess
was it,
that's-
people.
that's the end of episode 2.
Yep,
right?
that is
You know,
it. That is the end of episode 2 of Talkin Thrones, the Kingsroad. Thanks again to all the people who showed up this time around. We'll be back again this exact same time next week for episode 3. Entitled Lord Snow, obviously. So let us know your thoughts in the comment section below, what you thought of this specific episode, what you thought of season 1 in general, what your thoughts are kind of on our recap show going forward, if you think it's really going to change necessarily your appeal as far as, you know, moving towards that last season, obviously. And again, just if you have any other like interesting facts or tidbits or just interesting thoughts about Game of Thrones, leave them in the comment section below. Make sure you click the like button and the subscribe button. That way you guys can keep coming back and getting more awesome Talkin' TV content. We've got another fun-filled week. Obviously, we got Jupiter's Legacy on the podcast. We got Too Fast, Too Furious for the Fast and Furious first-time watch-along this week. It's going to be a lot of fun. You guys are not going to want to miss it. And like I said, we'll be back next week, obviously, with episode 3, Lord Snow. Pat, where the good people find you on the interwebs?
Right now, I'm just directing people to my Instagram at Patrick W. Huber. And, you know, basically, I keep threatening this, but I will post something at some point. You know, it's in the works. No, it's not really in the works. I just have to actually... I had to actually start posting. You know, I was posting for a little bit of time, and then I fell off the bandwagon. So
it
I
happens.
gotta get back
You know, real life happens. So, and you can find myself obviously again posting all the time on Talkin' TV Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. Follow us there for all the latest updates for the podcast, and you can follow myself personally at Movie Nerd Reviews on Facebook and Instagram. As always, people, winter is coming once again. 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you next week on the next episode of Talkin' Thrones.